Hello, and welcome to the Journeys of Folco Hornblower, the One Ring 2nd Edition Strider Mode Adventure. Book 3, Chapter 1. The road from the south gate to the main portion of the Great East Road was well maintained, as far as roads go in Eriador. The dirt and gravel that made up most of the road heading east was packed down well, with the frequent foot and cart traffic entering and leaving Bree from the likes of residents of Archet, Staddle, and Combe. The road had also become more hardened by the now falling temperatures of the cool night air, and the deciduous trees now turning shades of lighter green to light yellow, signaling autumn has finally arrived. Folco, with Billy at his side, like a trusted friend, walked eastwards, taking in as much of the sights and sounds of the Bree-Land, for who knows how long he will be away this time. The road east to the Misty Mountains, and evidently to Rivendell, somewhere in the valleys and foothills beyond the furthest river, Folco found out at least a 20-day walk, if it all went well. He figured a month was a safe bet, especially if something caught his eye along the way, or worse, he met those that would show ill will towards him. He was more careful and cautious now about those he would meet on the road, after his harrowing experience with the Southerners and the North Road. That was his plan, at the least. Billy, keep to your eyes and ears, and I to mine, and we shall reach Rivendell together, Folco said aloud, Billy neighing in agreement. The weather was fair, the wind was soft and cool, and no incident occurred to make Folco or Billy wary of the trip so far. As the sight of Bree Hill, and the great Chetwood to the north began to fade from view behind him, the topography steadily falls ever lower, and the damp, boggy quagmires that make up the Midgewater marshes borders the road to the north. Folco has heard stories of tall and short folk alike getting lost in the Midgewater, and no one, even the most experienced hunter, had been able to find traces of any creature to enter or leave, the ever-shifting pools and patches of reeds and rushes changing constantly. A handful of nights passed, and Folco spotted something that caught his eye to the south of the road, where the ground was higher and drier than that of the marshes. Folco had of course seen evidence of the era before now, the ancient kingdoms of men, but this ruin caught his eye especially. Bidding Billy to wait on the edge of the road, Folco walked towards the half-covered pile of worked stone, mere stone's throw away. Amongst the dense thicket of brambles, Folco saw what the stone was, a fallen statue of a king of old, for the kings of men ruled this land not so very long ago. Folco remembered hearing tales told of the pony, of Arnor and the later Cardolan. Folco brushed his hand against the now weathered stone and marveled at its craftsmanship. Nothing in Bree compared to what he had saw. What is this? Is that Athalas? Folco carefully took out his hunting knife, and cutting away at the overgrowth, and then carefully digging out the roots, Folco smiled, for he felt blessed by the day so far that he should find such a thing as kingsfoil, a weed most commonly thought of by most. Folco's grandfather always bid him, if he ever found it, to always find a way to take some, lest you are in need of something to heal the most grievous of wounds. Folco carefully wrapped the herb with a spare handkerchief, and placed it in his pack, only to spot another growing kingsfoil just out of sight. Had he not pondered the history of the statue, or the sight of the kingsfoil itself, he surely would have missed it. 4 days now have passed, with a few dwarves passing by on their way west to the Blue Mountains. Neither they or Folco stopped to chat. Folco suspect of anyone now traveling the roads, the dwarves suspect of a lone hobbit with a pony traveling away from Bree. Folco thought after that they may have figured he was a wandering spirit, for very few hobbits travel out of the hearth and home, let alone by themselves. He smiled and chuckled, and looked to Billy. Well, Bree hobbits are your typical Shire hobbits now, aren't they, Billy? And who's to say that I'm alone anyway? A Bree-Lander and his pony is a force to be reckoned with, I tell you that. Cresting over one of the numerous hills, Folco spotted it, not so far ahead, a long ago crumbling tower. Now overgrown and weathered, the ruins lay perched on the top of a hill just off the road. He had heard of this place, from passing travelers from the east, from rangers talking of it whenever he was able to eavesdrop on a conversation, about the old ruined tower called Weathertop. Rangers use it to see far off into the horizon, spotting danger wherever it may lurk. Or ill-intended men use it to ambush unsuspecting travelers on the Great East Road, stealing their wares and treasures. Rumors in Bree speak of the ruins being haunted, but fortunately for Folco, he was passing the ruins later in the afternoon, and the sun would set, bringing forth the darkness of the night, much later after he was out of sight of it. Folco kept the tower in view as he passed, keeping an eye to anything that seemed out of place, moving, unnatural. And as he passed, and although he saw or heard nothing, the eerie feeling of someone watching was ever present. Large stones, remnants of a long ago crumbling archway, crossed the road, flanked either side of the road. And as the sun was low in the western sky, the light brought out the now weathered but once majestic images of Elendil and Isildur on the stonework. After a short pause to take in the sight, Folco kept going. His main focus was to get to Rivendell without a moment to spare, as he wanted to get back to Bree before the winter settled in and the snow blanketed the countryside. No time to spare, he thought. Just at that moment he saw it. He wasn't sure at first if he was imagining things, or if the now low-lying clouds and wind through the trees and brushes were playing tricks to his eyes and ears. But Folco saw over on one of the hills to the south a fair and beautiful creature, a woman. He wasn't quite sure. Accompanying the woman were a handful of children at play, uncaring to the harsh wild around them. Despite the darkness of the late afternoon, the encroaching clouds, or the dim light of the cast by the setting of the sun, a soft and fair light seemed to emanate from all around them. Folco stood, mesmerized by the sight, his ears now hearing the soft, soothing sounds of singing from the woman and the playing laughter of the children. He stood, stared at the sight. Like a cloud in the sky gently moved its way westward. Time seemed to stand still, and the air around Folco felt that much warmer than before. The darkness that had been draped over his mind and body since the encounter with the nameless thing like a thin shawl seemed to disappear. A renewed sense of hope came over Folco, knowing that good still was out there in the wild, that light still could overcome the darkness, and that not everything was made of evil. With a gust of a brisk wind from the north, the woman and children faded away from sight, but not before the woman looked back to Folco, smiling and bowing before him. Folco still felt its glowing warmth and smiled, but now realizing the lateness of the afternoon, felt it was time to set up a small camp for the night. Folco awoke into a blanket of heavy, dense fog. The air was quiet, just the sound of Folco and Billy breathing and moving about camp. The dampness was a bit biting, and a chill Folco felt deep into his bones. Let us start a fire. At least a little warmth and some tea will help bolster our spirits, Billy. Folco panned about, and keeping in close eye to the fire as much as the fog allowed, his face showed a sign of concern. He had no idea in which direction the road lay, nor any direction he was facing. He looked for his tracks into the refuge he created last evening, but none he could find. Sitting back down and having a light breakfast, and a sip of warm tea, Folco looked around hoping something would trigger his memory, and he'd remember where the road lay, but nothing came to him. Cleaning up and dousing the fire with some dirt, it finally dawned on him. Billy! Billy would know where the road is. As any Bree-Lander knows, ponies of the Bree-Land have the uncanny ability to find their way back home. And all this time and you didn't say something? Just waiting for me to ask, weren't you? Well, lead the way to the road. You know where it is. Billy neighed and nodded, and with half huff, a laugh Folco waggered, Billy started to trot amongst the broken boulders and low brushes. Hopefully, Folco thought, to the road. Sure enough, after about a few hundred feet, Folco's feet were on the Great East Road once again. The fog remained thick for the remainder of the day and well into the next, and it wasn't until the late evening of the 7th day into his journey to Rivendell that the fog dissipated and the clear skies of autumn were coming into view. The road had been empty. No other travelers or caravans either met or overtook Folco, but he wagered not many would travel under such conditions. He continued along the road, and figured his pace of reaching Rivendell in 3 weeks was attainable. But something sullied his spirits. As a marker showing the midway point between Bree and the last bridge, he had just reached. He had hoped he was well past this mark by now, but nonetheless he would continue on his journey, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Now, midway through the second week of his journey, Folco saw in the distance just north of the road smoke rising from the ramshackle of a building. At first he thought it was some poor farmstead, owned by someone trying to etch out a life in the unforgiving wilderness. As he walked closer, he realized what he had spotted, for it wasn't a homestead at all, but, as he had heard before from travelers visiting the Prancing Pony, that the building was indeed the Forsaken Inn. This ramshackle of a place, half rotted by years of neglect, was alive with the most unsavory of patrons, by the looks of it, and Folco had always heard it was wise to stay clear of it, if ever he was in the vicinity of. So that is exactly what he did, and taking Billy off the road, he stayed clear from any prying eyes as best he could. Nothing came to bother Folco that evening. His seemingly slight detour worked in keeping him to a low profile. The next day, Folco arrived at the last bridge. The great stone bridge crossing what Folco could only gather was the Horwell, the bridge's large 3 arches spanning over the deep gorge. As it was midday, Folco paused for a quick lunch, and to ease his quivering stomach as he started to feel dizzy, peering over the side of the gorge and looking into the fast-flowing waters of the Horwell. The food had seemed to help, and taking a deep breath in and guiding Billy along, they crossed the old and weathered stones of the walkway. As he looked onward, he noticed what could only be the Trollshaws, as they were called, a vast, rough and rocky landscape, broken by patches of thick woodland. Folco had never seen one, but stories from his grandfather tell that the horrid brutes that make up this place its home lends to its name. Folco swallowed deeply at the thought of meeting a troll, and although he didn't say anything to Billy, he almost felt Billy thought the same. Folco kept to the road, and whenever nightfall was almost upon him, he would set up camp south of the road and away from the borders of the Trollshaws. Not that the south was any safer, for he knew everything outside of the safe confines of the hedge and Bree or outside any of the villages were dangerous always. The fire now he set very low, just enough to warm up some water, his hands and his feet. He made sure Billy was close. He wouldn't want any passing troll to steal him away from a hearty meal. Although restful, Folco felt the uncanny feeling that he was being watched, but he had not seen nor heard of any creature or beast throughout. The next morning he was met with a slight drizzle of rain, nothing serious, but enough to make the path muddied and slower to tread. By the end of the afternoon he came upon an unusually high hill south of the road. On top lay a mound of raised stones surrounded by large singular stones encircling it. Folco had no idea what it was, but he figured he'd keep to a safe distance and reach the far side of the hill, hopefully before nightfall set in. Folco found a small clearing just off the main road to the north. Not too far from it, mind you, as the start of the Trollshaws looming over ever presently a few hundred feet away. Folco began to set up camp in the wood to light a fire, when he felt something was amiss. A feeling of unease and darkness surrounded him. It wasn't the same as the ring he was wearing, but this was more of a primal in nature. Billy seemed uneasy as well, and Folco, grabbing his spear, readying his bow, bid Billy to stay, as Folco carefully made his way towards the edge of the Trollshaw. Not but 100 feet from camp, Folco saw it. Strewn across the muddied and dirty ground were the remnants of a camp, and what appeared to be a bloodied battle. The light of dusk was enough to see the splatters of pools of dirt-soaked blood, the breaking of arrows, smashing of a sizable horse-pulled cart. The footprints about were that of dwarves, Folco thought, and something else, large and unbooted. A thought came across his mind, and he shuddered at the thought, as he realized a troll had to be near. As he surveyed the scene, he followed a trail leading deeper into the wood, and whether it was his hobbit curiosity to see a troll in real, or to find out what happened, he didn't know. Carefully, he inched his way forward, spear at the ready. As he pulled back the branches of the trees ahead, he immediately turned his head back, the sight of what he saw causing him to urge and almost eject the previous meal that he had in his stomach. Folco took in a deep breath and regained his wits about him. And, looking again, he could not understand how such a creature, troll or otherwise, could do such a thing as he saw. Before him lay the dismembered remains of 3 dwarves, with just the torso remaining and the heads remaining intact. Looking around further, Folco saw their arms and legs all strewn about. Falco's spirit was dampened, and he felt the cold darkness and presence of his ring now starting to clench around him. Taking in a deep breath and focusing on the task at hand, he shrugged off the encroaching darkness. He hadn't the time nor the tools to properly attend to the bodies. He didn't know the customs of the doors well enough to know how best to go about it anyway. He would remember this place, however, and if ever he found out how best to, he would return to set this poor man to rest. A large, booming sound of wood being splintered and cracked echoed throughout the area, Folco now bending low and out of sight. Ahead, down what appeared to be a trail made by the would-be troll, and Folco ever so carefully went down it. Despite the low light of dusk, Folco clearly could see the trail left by the troll. The footprints seemed to almost pop out from the surrounding dirt, almost as if there was some sort of luminescence to it. He had no trouble in seeing the tracks, even as he traveled further into the canopy of the wood, and all around him the shadow of the night encroached. What is it that was helping his vision? He could not know. Was it the ring, he wondered? Folco had followed the trail, but then suddenly lost it, as the ground turned from the soft vegetated ground of a forest floor to the hardness of rock. Folco crouched low and behind some brush, breathing slowly and deeply, as quietly as possibly could, careful not to let the tip end of the spear or the bow slung across his back to scrape against the hard rock. Suddenly, out of nowhere, off to the side and over a rock outcropping, Folco heard the breaking and moving of wood again against stone. As he had opened his eyes more to let in more of the dim light of dusk, he saw it. Peering out over the ledge, he saw the bald head of a large humanoid creature. As the creature lumbered out over, it peered from side to side, and then looked back to whatever hole it crawled out of. It was a large creature, muscular shoulders and arms, but a bulbous torso that protruded out over a tattered and dirty loincloth-type garment. Its legs, arms, and feet were bare, but covered in coarse, scraggly hair. It took in a deep breath and was about to move when suddenly the wind shifted, and it started to sniff about the air. Folco sensed it could smell him as he clenched the spear tighter, but still lay motionless like a rock on solid footing. Folco could only guess what it was, as he had never seen one before, but only heard through stories told, that the creature, only a short distance away, was a stone troll. Folco smiled, but then realized he was in serious danger, as he knew these creatures were not to be messed with, especially one so close to their holes. He waited, therefore, waited for his chance to sneak back away and down towards the road where Billy awaited. The troll now sniffed some more, but then grunted and turned around and slumped back down into its hole, as Folco heard more breaking and scraping of wood against rock, with the occasional growl from deep within. Folco could only wager it was doing something within its hole, making it bigger, fortifying it, or whatever else trolls do within their own. Folco took the opportunity to vacate, and that he did, without the slightest sound being made. Folco, as fast as he could while still being as stealthily as possible, made his way back to Billy, still waiting for him like a seasoned sentry guarding a castle gate. "Quick, Billy, and as quietly as possible. Let's head further east into the south side of the road. A troll lurks above." Billy nodded, but heeded Folco's command and did not neigh as he normally would have. The two climbed back onto the road and down over the opposing side of the embankment with which the road rested on. An hour passed, and Folco, and under the now light of the rising moon, and feeling that he was a safe distance away from the troll, made camp for the night. Folco dared not light a fire this night, and pulling out his heavy wool blanket, rested up against Billy for warmth. The next morning came without incident, and the sun, rising over the now visible and numerous peaks of the misty mountains, off to the distance, awakened Folco. Falco gazed at the wondrous view, as the sun now cast its yellowish-red rays of light down into the slopes of the mountains, and into the main foothills and valleys throughout. Without knowing it, Falco set himself up on a high ridge, and was able to see far out over many leagues. A large river flowed from northeast to southwest, and Falco thought to himself that this must be the Loudwater, with its headwaters flowing from the high up in the misty mountains, and then joining the Horwell to flow then into the Greyflog, on its way to the sea. Falco smiled and was now more excited than ever, as he realized he was close. If his assumptions to the answer of the riddle given to him by Bilbo, Rivendell lay somewhere east of the Loudwater, amongst the many deep valleys in the foothills, and high moors west of the misty mountains. Smiling, Falco turned to Billy. "Come now, Billy, we're almost there." The two, unlikely of companions this far east of Bree, now back on the road and keeping to a good pace, made their way to the river. Book 3, Chapter 2. The late morning autumn sun, now high over the valleys and foothills of the misty mountains, blanketed the road with warmth, and after a cold and deep damp, fireless night, was very welcomed by Falco. With Billy at his side, Falco trekked with an increased pace on the Great East Road towards the river Bree-Land. He was surprised at the lack of traffic along the road, even for this time of the year, and wondered what may have kept the regular flow of dwarven and barding traders from the past the misty mountains, traveling west and back home eastward. Then the images of the dismembered remains of the dwarven merchants flashed across his mind. A moment of despair came across Falco. Have trolls or other foul beasts claimed this portion of the road and land for themselves? Falco stopped, and halting Billy, clutched his spear harder and looked and listened. He didn't sense anything out of place, and although he continued at a decent pace eastwards along the road, he was now more attentive and aware of his surroundings, keeping an ever-watchful eye for any possible danger. Midday, and therefore lunch, came and went, and shortly thereafter, Falco reached the western bank of the Bree-Land. The ford over the river was well sited. A seemingly natural rise in the riverbed provided enough height that during this time of the year one could easily cross it on foot, horse, or beast-drawn cart. Even for a hobbit the river came only to his knees, and its highest along the crossing. As he surveyed the banks to the east and west, the high water marks of what he guessed would be the spring runoff. But something was out of place and caught his eye. That the high water mark seemed to have been created not that long ago, maybe less than a month. Maybe the reason for the decreased traffic along the road is due to the inability to cross the river, he thought. And other routes must have been taken to get to the west. Crossing the river with no issue, Falco now looked back westward, across the Bree-Land. He hadn't realized the grade at which the road descended towards the river, and he could only imagine how difficult it would be to pull a heavily laden cart full of goods up and over the valley walls of the Bree-Land. The section of road he now found himself on ran parallel northward along the banks of the river before turning to the east and up over the eastern slope of the valley. Falco continued along it, and once at the top of the valley, and looking down on the river and across the now flat, grass and rocky moors, he took a rest for a quick snack, a smoke of his pipe, and Billy grazing on the wild grasses of the highlands. Falco pulled out the letter from Bilbo with the riddle and read it once more. Below the mist of the mountain, clouds of white touching stone. The valley lies below. A river cross you go. Falco, while snacking on some berries, the last of his bread, and drawing on his pipe, he pondered on the words and let his mind wander. Mountains, stone, white, valley, river cross. Falco, quietly and methodically drawing in and blowing smoke from his pipe, panned and stared off into the distance. It was at this time something caught his attention. Off towards the side of the road, which at this point along the eastern section past the river was little more than a well-trodden path of hard-packed ground, he saw a glistening, a sparkle of white, Was it a piece of polished steel, a piece of glass, or a well-polished stone? Falco didn't know. But as the sun moved further past the midpoint of its arc across the sky, the flickering had faded and was seen no more. White touching stone. Could it be that which we seek, Billy? Will the fate of fortune be on our side this day? Let us check it out, shall we? Filled with a rejuvenated sense of hope, Falco cleaned up, and going off the road, proceeded northeast towards where he thought the glistening stone rested. It couldn't have been no more than a couple 100 yards away, but he noticed nothing out of the ordinary from the pale green and yellow grasses, the large gray and weathered boulders that dotted the highlands he found himself on. Nothing seemed to Falco at least capable of producing such a spectacle as reflecting the sunlight towards him moments earlier. His hope diminished, and he started to question whether he saw what he saw, and if it was just a figment of his imagination, a mirage. He had heard stories from his grandfather that those lost in the wild would see things that were not there, like fresh, clean pools of open water, only to be found later by searching parties to be surrounded by nothing more than dry, barren, and desolate ground, with no water for miles and miles. Fortunately for Falco, he had rationed supplies, so he didn't feel like he would be running out of any so soon. He looked around, taking in as much of the landscape as he could. He gazed and panned his vision from northwest to northeast, and then he spotted it. Obscured by a patch of brush along the sides of a large rocky outcrop, Falco saw a small white-colored stone. "Look, Billy, that's it. White touching stone. For sure we didn't stop to eat and rest. We would have missed this along the road." Falco ran at a good pace towards his finding. The stone was nothing out of the ordinary, in fact quite ordinary as far as quartz goes. Falco wasn't a miner after all, but what was strange was that despite all the stone throughout the area, this was the only showing of a seemingly polished milky white stone that he could see. Doubt now crossed his mind. Was this the answer to Bilbo's riddle? He began to look for more rocky outcrops and spotted a handful here and there a fair distance away. From his vantage point, they all looked the same, gray, black, and mostly grass-covered. Then he remembered the second line, "The valley lies below." Was it in fact the ruin where Rivendell would ultimately lie? Or was there another river, or a waterless valley, that created the hidden lands for the elves? Falco stood on the mound of rocks harboring the quartz. Now he could see from the higher vantage point for miles and miles, and if it not were for his climbing up higher, he would have missed it. Far off to the northwest was a sharp drop-off that signaled the top edges of a deep valley. He took note of the features leading up to where he currently was, and to the edge, and then climbed down to where Billy patiently waited, chewing on some grasses next to the rocks. Falco looked towards the direction of where the valley lay, and slowly nodded his head. He for sure would have missed it if he had not realized the valley existed where it was. Whether naturally created or at the hand of the elves, for Falco knew they could do marvelous wonders outside the realm of mere hobbits, or men for that matter, the land looked continuous and uninterrupted. "I think we found it, Billy, the valley that lies below, or at least I hope so." Falco laughed, Billy neighing in response. The two, unlikely of travelers this far from Bree Hill, now traversing the roadless land northwestward, and after a handful of miles, they reached it, the uppermost edges of the valley created by the waters of the Bree-Land. Falco gazed in wonderment at the sight, for he had never seen anything like it around Bree Hill, or even the short time in the Shire. The river lay hundreds of feet below where he stood, carving out its path for what would have been thousands of years, Falco thought. Along the sheer, steep walls of the valley were lines and layers of pine trees, the sweet scent carried by the cool breeze within the valley, up and past Falco's senses. Falco smiled, and his hope renewed, as he thought the right path to Rivendell was here. But he saw no sign of the failed home of the elves, nor any path down to the valley. Undaunted, he proceeded, following the edge, northeastward. The sun now settled deep into the western sky, and the deep orange and reds now filling the early evening. Finding a suitable place to camp, Falco felt at ease, as if the area had been free of any ill will towards him or Billy, a much different feeling than he had just previously experienced, what seemed like an eternity ago. but was only the previous night. As the sun now settled further below the western horizon, and the moon now crested the peaks of the misty mountains to the east, Falco sat and ate, and smoked some old Toby, rested peacefully throughout the night. Like the morning before, the brightness and sudden warmth of the sun as it rose over the peaks of the misty mountains, which were now quite visible some 40 or 50 miles away, Falco stood amazed at the mountain range, its snow-capped tops spreading as far as the eyes could see to the north and to the south, like a tall fence made of impenetrable stone. Falco had heard about the misty mountains and the lands beyond from the travelers hailing from the dwarven halls of the Iron Mountains and Erebor, of the bardings from Dale and the occasional elf from Mirkwood, but he scarcely could believe those tales he had heard, given the sheer size and the magnitude of the mountains of mist that now lay to the east before his sight. His moment of thought, being lost in the majestic wonder of the misty mountains, was broken by the neighing of Billy, and as he turned around to view his trusted pony, he noticed what seemed Billy was wanting his attention for was another, seemingly out of place, but then again not, a milky white quartz rock, right next to them, at their place of rest. Well, it's almost as if we're being led to Rivendell itself, as it appears we're on the right trail, Billy. Now, let us have a hearty breakfast, and find us more of those rock and hopefully Rivendell before the day's end. Falco kept good track of the days, noting this being the start of the 20th day out of Bree. His pack was much lighter now, with most of his preserves now eating, save for a small piece of jerky, a cracker, and a handful of berries with which he found along the way. Fortunately, he had been able to forage throughout, but he scarcely saw enough game along the road to be of any sustenance, and he dared not stray too far from the road unless it was absolutely necessary for survival. The images of the dwarves continued to weigh heavily on his mind. Then the attack by the Southerners flashed again before his eyes. A moment passed, and the sweet, subtle sense of the pine came across him, and he was reminded what he was doing so far from Bree in the first place, to find Rivendell. Let us go. No time to waste, Billy. We cannot tarry any longer. Falco surveyed the area, and aside from the one whitish-colored rock near him, he saw no other near. Taking in a deep draw of air and slowly letting it out, he proceeded north along the eastern edge of the cliff, leading down to the broom. 2 hours passed, and it was close to midday that he found another white stone along the edge of the drop-off. Falco peered over the edge, and in his amazement he saw it. Not far to the side, a narrow path, not 3 to 4 feet wide, on the side of the valley's eastern wall. Falco saw that the path was infrequently traveled, as debris from the trees and winds blowing over the highlands littered the trail. Fallen rocks from the edges, blown branches, leaves, and grasses all laid about, but the trail appeared well traveled otherwise, and seemed to be quite strong. He looked past into the valley, and he could see the path switch back and forth down, and then behind a bend out of sight. The scent of pine now was stronger than before, as scores of old, tall pine grew along the edges of the valley. The river was glistening in the sun, as the water flowed across many rock formations, creating large, impassable rapids. There would be no way for any boat, of men or elf for that matter, that would be able to traverse such a sight, Falco thought. Taking a moment to gather his wits about him, he ensured the gear on Billy's back was secured, and he carefully proceeded down the pathway into the valley below. Falco took his time navigating the narrow path clinging to the valley walls. One false move and both he and Billy would surely fall to the bottom, he thought. 2 hours passed before Falco reached the bend in the path that wrapped around the cliff face and followed the river. As he did, and the majestic sight of what he saw came into view, forced Falco to stand back in awe and wonder. The river Bree-Land and the many falls that flowed from either side of the valley glistened with dance-like grace in the mid-afternoon sun. The pine that welcomed Falco at the top was now replaced with a flourishing growth of beech and oak, all different colors of the autumn. A faint sound came over the wind across Falco's ears, a sound of song, light and fair, almost as if the very valley itself was singing a song of peaceful serenity. Falco's mind and heart were at peace. Even the shadow that has been with him since the finding of the silver ring he now wore seemed to fade away. Nestled along the edges and on both sides of the river, houses and structures of elvish make rose up, and the tallest majestically alone like a peak of a mountain. He smiled, and looking at Billy, he led them on. As lateness of the day approached and the sun now setting low and behind the walls of the valley, the long dark shadow of the evening was starting to cast on Rivendell. Falco could scarcely believe his eyes as each of the buildings, the waters, and even the trees themselves seemed to glow a soft, white light, keeping the darkness at bay. Flickers of an orange-red glow he could see coming to light all throughout the buildings that made up Rivendell, as well as what Falco thought was the only way across the river, a lone stone bridge. As Falco drew nearer, a chorus of elves throughout the valley sang in unison, again with a sense of peace and serenity. Falco's heart warmed at what he had so far experienced, never realizing the true wonderment of the majesty of the elves until now. The path that he was on turned the last of the corners. The full view of the bridge now lay before him. 2 large statues of elven warriors of old guarded the narrow stone bridge spanning the Bree-Land. On the opposite ends was a circular tower. Falco wondered why no one was out to greet him as of yet. Surely someone must have seen him traverse the distance by now. But no one could be seen. Only the singing and the rushing of the river below Falco heard. He looked around once more, and then, with Billy in tow behind him, walked the narrow bridge across the river. Vertigo washed over Falco, and he questioned his resolve. But he hurried as fast as he could and reached the other side, and walked under the arched opening of the circular tower. Falco relaxed his breathing. He walked onward, and standing in complete awe and wonder, he looked over the entirety of Rivendell. On the lower flats, many elvish buildings rose from the ground, as if planted and grown, almost looking as natural as the pine, beech, and oak of the valley itself. Past these buildings rose a marvelous structure, again seemingly natural to the surroundings. Tall, majestic, with a center spire seemingly reaching for the now emerging stars in the sky. A large circular plaza with a fountain in the center welcomed Falco, as he kept walking towards it without even realizing that he was doing so, lost in the majesty of the place. Falco then saw a figure, a man-elf, tall and graceful, was walking down the set of stone stairs leading down from the main building. Waving his hand in greeting, and then across his chest and bowing his head, the elf spoke. "Greetings and welcome to Imladris. Lord Elrond bids you to join him." With that, he gestures to Falco to proceed up the stairway. Falco, taken aback at the sudden acceptance of his presence and an invite so soon, was seemingly lost for words. Yes, of course. But what of Billy? Yes, Billy. Falco now brushing his hand across Billy's mane. From behind Falco, surprising him in the process, an elf maiden smiled and bowed before Falco, and taking the reins from him for Billy, walked him towards what Falco could only guess was a stable. Falco was amazed, for even the stable was as elegant as any building he had ever seen. Falco smiled and fixed his garments, and nodding to the elf, still bidding him to walk the steps to the main house, we walked up the stone stairs. As he crested the last step, the wonder of the place was still in full view. Falco was escorted past the elegantly crafted open archway of the front porch, and past an already open heavy wooden door, opening into a long corridor, and then past and further into a great hall. Falco stood and took in the craftsmanship and artistry of the place, never before seeing such a sight. The floor was paved with flagstones from rock unlike what he had ever seen in the valley or the stones above, but of somewhere else entirely. Lanterns hung from the carven wood beams supporting the vaulted ceiling, and between each, along the walls, were banners, flags, and pennants of various colors, crests, and the like. What these represented, Falco did not know, but by the looks of them, all of them were from a time long, long ago. In the center, a large lantern, seemingly out of place, almost dwarven in make, hung from the ceiling, casting a reddish light, making the chamber look like it's deep underneath the earth. and if it weren't for the slight refreshing breeze of the valley outside and the sound of the rushing river, Folco wouldn't have thought he was above the surface. Welcome, Master Hornblower. It is a pleasure to have you here in my home, Rivendell. Folco turned around, and standing before him, stern yet welcoming, was a tall elf, with a fair face like the other elves he had encountered so far, with dark hair and his garments elegantly majestic to match. I am Elrond Half-Elven. I bid you come. Let us break bread, and tell of your journey here, to the valley of Imladris. Lord Elrond now motions back out to the main corridor and to the right of the main porch, and towards the great hall. Folco bowed his head before Elrond, and looking towards the screen passage separating the room from the corridor, he walked in. The room was long and much less wide in comparison. A balcony alcove, which now Folco noticed above the entrance, sat a handful of elven minstrels, who began to play and sing for the upcoming meal. The high table stood on a dais at the far end of the room, with two long tables perpendicular to the high table, lined either side of the great room, and a great hearth in the middle that was lit with a fire. Set on the high table was a spread of food and seating for what appears to have been only for Folco and for Elrond. Led by a female elf, Folco was ushered to take a seat near Elrond. As he walked towards his seating, he gazed in amazement at the intricate tapestry hanging on the wall adjacent to the table, depicting a white ship riding a wave on an immense sea, heading towards what looked like the setting of the sun. A breeze from outside ruffled the tapestry, and to Falco's wonder it almost appeared as if the waves themselves were in motion. As both Folco and Elrond stood next to the table, Elrond bid Folco to sit, and he obliged. A handful of elves came out with baskets of bread, fresh leafy greens, other vegetables, and wine. The minstrels in the alcove at the far end began to play their stringed instruments and sing soft melodies. Elrond, on breaking bread, spoke to Folco. Now, Folco, what brings you to my home via the Great East Road? Folco stopped midway into eating a piece of bread, and laying the piece down on his plate, he swallowed what he had already in his mouth, and proceeded to take out the letter from his vest inner pocket. I was sent by Mr. Bilbo Baggins, I do believe you know him, to deliver this letter to you, Master Elrond, here in Rivendell. Elrond let out an uncharacteristic smile and received the letter now handed over by Folco. Elrond opened the letter, and after a few moments, closed it up and laid it down on the opposite side of where Folco sat. Folco nervously was eating some morsels of bread and greens. Folco sensed that Elrond was receptive of the letter, written by Bilbo, but had not yet let on what the contents of the letter said. Elrond continued to eat. It is customary amongst my kin, both the Bree hobbits and from what I have witnessed so far in the short travel to the Shire, that conversing is welcomed when enjoying food and drink. Is this customary amongst you and your kin as well, Master Elrond? Folco, now feeling a little more at ease, surprisingly, Elrond gave a slight smile and then regained more of his melancholic look. Well, I tend to let our guests be free, to express themselves as they wish. This is not so with all elves, but feel welcome to speak freely here. Elrond gestured accordingly, and speaking with a slight elvish accent. Folco felt more at ease, and with the demeanor shown by Elrond, he appeared most willing to hear Folco out, whatever that may be. Folco ate another morsel of food, and taking in a fine sip of wine, smiled and nodded. This is a very fine wine, and robust. Do you make it yourself here in the valley? I don't believe I've ever tasted an elvish wine. No, I don't believe I have. This is quite excellent. Elrond nodded. Yes, well, I would be very much like to take some home to my parents. I'm sure they would be more than happy to have over a special dinner. Folco now feeling more emboldened as he continued to eat, drink, and talk. I am sure we can spare some of our wine, Elrond responded. Now, tell me, what is it that you found below the Shire? Elrond now looking at Folco suspiciously. Folco half choked on some food when he heard the inquiry, and coughing and taking a sip of wine, responded. Yes, well, you see, it's a bit of a long story, and, well, I'm sure nothing compares to what you've seen before, but, you see, Falco was lost for words. We elves do live a long time, Elrond responded rather curtly. Falco nodded and chuckled, and paused, then continued. He restarted to recount the events of his first journey to the Shire, how he came to meet Bilbo, his journey to Banfurlong, the happenings of the Old Forest, him meeting Tom and Goldberry. Falco figured Elrond would have interjected on some of the news, but he remained silent. Falco, unsure if he was listening or paying attention at all, continued and spoke of his intended journey to the Greenfields from Woodhall, but took a stop in Brockenbors to help out in exploring the mines under the hills of Skerry. Upon telling of the nameless creature, Elrond seemed more engaged to the conversation. Falco then proceeded to tell him of the rest of the journey back to Bree. By the time Falco had finished his story, both he and Elrond had finished most of the food. As Falco continued, he pulled out his pipe and was about to clean it when he paused. It is customary for my kin to partake in some smoking of pipeweed after a fine meal, and such a fine meal it was. May I? Falco now motioning to light his rose-filled pipe. Elrond nodded. Falco started to clean the inside chamber and the outside of his pipe. Well, you see, once I was in Bree and a few days had passed, I wrote a letter to Bilbo to help me out. You see, Falco paused, and laying the pipe down on the table, he put his hands together and was twisting the silver ring he had found around his finger. You see, I was in need of some information about something, and Bilbo sent me to you. Here, to Rivendell. Elrond took in a deep breath and sat back and straight against the chair. What did you find, Falco? Elrond was quick to respond, looking rather curiously at Falco now, more than before. Falco now looked down at the ring on his index finger. The silver-colored ring which he had been twisting, he took off and placed it on the table between himself and Elrond. Elrond looked down at the ring and then at Falco. May I? He asked of Falco. Falco nodded rather reluctantly. Yes, of course. That is why I am here, to answer the riddle of this ring. But before you touch it, you must know. Know of what? Elrond interrupted. Falco swallowed and let out a long breath before responding. Well, that there is a dark shadow attached to it, one that has darkened my very being ever since I found it. I don't want to say it's cursed, but what other words are there to explain it? I believe that foul creature, that nameless thing I saw below the hills of Skerry, whatever it was, tainted the very metal and rock with which it was made in its lair. What else could explain this feeling? Elrond now looked at Falco intently, and then to the ring. Falco now, picking up his pipe again, packing in some old Toby and lighting it, watched closely as Elrond now picked up the ring and was studying it. Whatever darkness that had come over Falco when he put it on, at first, Elrond didn't act as if the same washed over him. Falco studied Elrond as closely as Elrond was studying the ring, half curious, but also half afraid that Elrond would ask Falco to give up for good. Falco saw subtle changes in Elrond's breathing, his facial expressions, even the way he was holding the ring after some time had passed. He placed the ring back on the table. Falco looked at Elrond briefly, and as he reached to pick it up, Falco asked, What do you make of it? Any information you can tell me about it? I know it's nothing out of the Shire, or a smithies in Bree. Never seen anything of this detail come out of there before. I'm fascinated to know what and where it's from. Elrond pushed back his chair, and then standing, looking intensely at Falco, boldly said, Come with me. Elrond quickly turned and marched down the steps and into the main floor of the chamber. Falco quickly scrambled and pushed back his chair. Not knowing what to do with his now lit smoking pipe, he emptied the contents in the empty dish before him, and laid it down on the table, and rushed to catch up with Elrond, now leaving the great hall. As Falco passed the upper alcove, the elven maidens stopped their instruments and sung. Passing now through the corridor and into the hall with the glowing red lantern hanging low from the ceiling, Elrond led Falco up to the upper floors and into what later Falco would find out was Elrond's own personal library. Book 3, Chapter 3. Falco followed Elrond up the stone steps to the upper rooms of the main house, feeling the now sudden looks of some of the other elves that occupied the building, looks of amazement and curiosity. Elrond hadn't said a word or acknowledged any presence in stepping away from the table downstairs, intent on reaching wherever he was headed, in haste. What was it about the ring that troubled Elrond so? Falco wondered. Past the first and onto the second floor, Elrond led Falco through a common room in the center, the high ceiling supported by elaborately carved wooden beams, and into the chamber that would be the library and map room, the depository of knowledge collected through the ages. Falco stood in amazement and wonder, never before seeing such a repository of books, scrolls, maps, and the like. Elrond continued to show no signs Falco was there, intent on searching for something within the shelves along the walls. Falco stood at the entrance to the library, patiently waiting for anything from Elrond that would tell Falco why they were there. Elrond pulled out a fairly large tome, elaborately decorated with seemingly gold and silver filigree, nothing of the likes Falco had ever seen. Elrond moved over to the wooden table in the center of the room and motioned for Falco to sit. Falco obliged. There was a time before your kin dug into the hole of Bree, a time before the Shire was given, a time when Elven and Dwarven kingdoms shared a common love for craft, a time when the darkness had not yet blanketed this land. Elrond stood now next to Falco and laid the Elvish tome on the table, in clear view for Falco. Opening it, and although Falco could not read it, recognized it for what it was, Elvish script. Elrond flipped through the pages, landing at a page showing an illustration of a great city along a river with mountains in the distance. Elrond continued. My people built the city of Ost-End and Hill on the river Saronan. The kingdom was Eregion, ruled by Celebrimbor. Elrond continued to flip through the pages of the tome. Falco focused fixed on the art and elegantly written word of the work. Elrond stopped at a drawing of elf artisans, 3 in fact, 2 male and 1 female. Celebrimbor was the greatest artisan of our time, second only to Fëanor, his grandfather. Elrond pointed to the center figure. Nithig, Elrond now pointing to the elf woman to Celebrimbor's left, was an artificer, a jewel smith under Celebrimbor. It is told she crafted wings of mithril, of swan feather, to soar in the sky with the birds she so dearly loved. Before pointing to the next figure, to Celebrimbor's right, Elrond paused, and Falco noticed hesitation. The male-looking figure was tall, fair, and dressed in white garments. And this was Annatar, emissary of the Valar, who taught Celebrimbor and the other elvish artificers the skill and craft of ring-making. Elrond closed the book hard and sudden. Falco jumped back in surprise. Elrond placed it back into the shelf where he found and taken it, then proceeded to the room entrance. Come with me, he bid to Falco. Falco again responded with haste, quickly jumping out of the chair and following Elrond. As he had led to a large room, glass windows showing a panoramic view of the outside, with chairs, tables, and finely crafted marble chess set in front of a center large window. Elrond bid him to sit in one of the chairs, Elrond sitting down opposite Falco. Your ring was crafted by Nithig, more than 4,500 years ago, in Ost-End and Hill. Nithig, her fate was sealed before the fall of Eregion, to the enemy, before... Elrond paused again, now looking out past into the darkness of the night, and although Falco could not see it in his overall appearance, Elrond's eyes showed an old pain that seemed to have lingered for what some would call an eternity. Elrond continued. Before a host of elves in alliance with Numenor drove the enemy out of Eriador and back to Mordor. Elrond paused and looked over to Falco. It is commonly told that Nithig was slain during the War of the Elves and the enemy, but that, Falco, is not the entirety of her tale. Elrond stood and walked over to the chess set. Falco now paid a little attention to it, and noticed that pieces seemed to have been already in play. Falco not sure what Elrond was doing, as he moved one of the gaming pieces along the table and in place. Falco, now wondering if he should say something or not, spoke anyway, to break the silence. Ah, so Nithig crafted this ring, and she wasn't slain in the War of the Elves, and you said the enemy? Who is this enemy you speak of? Falco had no idea who the enemy was, but he assumed it was very bad, especially if a host, however big a host was, waged a war against the elves. Elrond, without looking at Falco, responded, "I will not utter his name here, nor speak it, as it would cast a dark shadow across this land. The dark speech of Mordor has not been uttered here, nor shall it." Elrond stared at the chess pieces, his hands now tucked behind his back. He continued, "Nethig, yes. Love she had for another, some say even Celebrimbor himself. But I do not think so. When the enemy came to Eregion, in disguise, he tried to persuade Nethig to share her secrets with him. She refused, and the enemy grew wroth." Elrond turned around to now face Falco. Nethig liked to walk alone within the forest of Swanfleet, and a poisonous serpent stung her with its fangs. She did not heal like our kin healed, for the poison was wrought with malice and cruelty. Elrond walked to the view valley once again. Falco stood and peered out as well into the starry night, and the now lantern-lit buildings of Rivendell. Falco again noticed that faint glow of whitish light emanating all throughout. She was given a choice all our kin must make, to go to the west over the sea, to the Undying Lands, or she could abandon her body and send her spirit winging west to the halls of Mandor, to wait out the world. Elrond looked down at Falco, Falco now looking up at Elrond. What happened to her? Falco now looking down at the silvery ring. She chose neither, Master Hornblower. Elrond now looked back onto the valley. She loved the lands of Middle-earth more than she loved her life itself. In complete desperation, she forged another ring, the bearer to fall into an enchanted slumber and remain untouched by all time. She was found in the Swanfleet and placed on a bier, and a palace was built where she would now rest, until a time one could heal her. Elrond now stopped. His eyes were lost in the darkness of the valley below. You must find Nethig's resting place, for that is the only way to rid yourself of the shadow that encompasses the ring. And now, your mind and heart. Elrond now staring at Falco intently. Falco felt the gaze of Elrond deep within his mind. Although he didn't think elves could read one's thoughts, Falco made sure not to think anything unkindly of Elrond, or elves in general for that matter. Falco took in a deep breath, opened his mouth, then closed it, giving an expression of confusion. Where would one find this palace, this place where Nethig rests? Falco now with enough courage to ask. That we will discuss tomorrow. Elrond now turned and walked out to the common communal space just outside the Solar Room. Falco followed. Now standing outside of the entrance stood a beautiful young elf maiden. She bowed before Falco. Falco lost for any words, awestruck with her timeless beauty, like a carefully planted garden in full bloom. Falco bowed in return. Arwen will now take you to your room. Elrond bowed his head and left down past the library, where Falco previously had been, and down a flight of stairs and out of sight. Falco was still awestruck with Arwen. Never before had he been graced with such beauty. Arwen stepped back and waved Falco to follow her. Come with me, Master Hornblower. Falco followed, and Arwen led Falco down the same flight of steps as Elrond had taken, and onto the second floor. Guiding him to the guest room, Falco could scarcely believe what he saw. Unlike the prancing pony, Woodhall, even Brandy Hall or Bag End itself could compare, Falco thought it kingly in its decoration and setting. My father and I hope you find this suiting to your needs. Falco nodded, still lost for words. Arwen smiled. Rivendell is open to all my father bids welcome. May you rest with peace. With that, Arwen spoke an elvish greeting of good night, and as Falco watched her leave and back up to the stairs to the upper floors, he finally had the courage to say, good night, in response. The morning air was crisp but sweet, and Falco heard the wind rustling through the trees making up the Rivendell, and the flowing waters of the Bruin and below, and the falls nearest to the main house of Elrond. The sun shone brightly, and as Falco peered out to the open archway and onto the railed balcony of his room, The full splendor and wonder of Rivendell was in full view. Folco was lost for words, taking it all in, placing it into the deep recesses of his memory, so as to never forget. Without knowing it, his traveling wear was now hanging, clean and well tended. He didn't remember waking up and giving his garments to anyone either last night, or early morning, but there they were, nonetheless. Although nice, Folco didn't care much for the sleep garments that were given to him, but wondered how they already had hobbit-sized garments. May it have been Bilbo's visit to Rivendell those many years ago, and since, that the elves made such garments in case another hobbit chanced to visit? Either way, Folco would ask the next elf he saw, if other of his kin had visited Rivendell before. Folco changed into his clothes and walked out into the communal space. The sweet smell of incense permeated the air, the soft sound of singing coming from the other side of the hall. The sound was attractive, his sense of wonder now of where and who had been singing it. He went to the stairwell and heard it coming from downstairs. He saw no others, elf or otherwise. Where he stood, the sound now seemingly coming from past the entrance hall, with the dormer lantern, the eastern porch of the main house. Folco slowly walked out, and to his surprise no one was there. Folco saw the full grandeur of the valley, however before his eyes, the transition of summer to autumn now almost fully complete. The pines still a deep green, the oaks and beech now showing the ranges of yellows, oranges, and reds. Walking past followed the course of the now loud flowing waters of the Bree-Land, heading off into unknown areas of the mountains, surrounding and to the trees themselves. I hope your night was restful. Folco lost in the splendor of the view, not realizing Elrond had entered the space. Surprised, but calmly, Folco replied, Very much so. If I were to stay here for the rest of my life, I'd be quite content, Master Elrond. The valley is always open to friends of the free peoples of Middle-earth. Come, let us eat, and I will tell you what you need to know about your ring, and where you should look to find Nethig's resting place. Elrond now gesturing to Folco to the side door, and into the great hall, to feast once again on the bounty of the valley below. After a hearty breakfast, to elvish standards, Elrond called for tea. Sitting back and folding his hands together, he spoke. The final resting place of Nethig I do not know. The maiden road of Eregion is all but lost to the ravages of time, and the forest for which she walked is now but a mire. Perhaps the elders of Madcot may know of what palace that now would lie hidden below the mire. An elf maiden brought in freshly brewed herbal tea and poured both Elrond and Folco cups, leaving the pot in between them. Elrond continued. It is too late for you now to travel to Swanfleet, but when the flowers of spring begin to blossom, make your way to Tharbad, and then find passage to Swanfleet. Medcot lies there. From there you are on your own in finding the palace and Nethig's resting place. Folco, with his cup in hand, taking a sip of the tea, laid it back down on the table. Thank you, Lord Elrond, for your counsel and your hospitality. It is most graciously welcomed. Elrond nodded his head in thanks. He raised his hand, Folco not noticing an elven steward bringing a number of items with him. Laying down on the table between Folco and Elrond, now rested a bottle of what Folco thought was fine elvish wine he had tasted the evening before, a cylindrical, leather-bound case, as well as a handful of small, opaque glass vials protected by straps of leather. Elrond picked up the bottle and handed it over to Folco. As requested, for your parents, the best of our wines. Folco's face now flushed, smiled, nodded, and his voice crackled as he said, Thank you. He handed the 2 vials. This is Miravor, and it will serve you well on your journeys, should you need it. Elrond proceeded to explain of its uses, one of a medicinal tonic for the expedited healing of wounds, the other to give clarity of mind and thought when needed for difficult tasks. Finally, Elrond handed Folco the case, smiling. Luckily for Bilbo, you succeeded on your task given to you from him. Here is what he requested. He shall be most pleased of your return, I am sure. Folco laughed. Well, yes, I'm sure he will. Folco now wished he had something to give in return, and then he remembered. He quickly stood, Elrond surprised at the sudden movement. Wait, I have something to give in return. Off Folco went. Elrond raised his eyebrow, intrigued. Moments passed and Falco returned, now with a large smile on his face. Sitting down and resting his handkerchief on the table between them, Falco began to unwrap it. Elrond watched in curiosity. Falco carefully opened up the handkerchief, and to Elrond's surprise, Falco presented the Athelas plant he took from his journey to Rivendell. Elrond now looked at Falco in a form of amazement. Elrond graciously accepted the offering. Athelas is quite a potent healing herb. This is most welcome. As for your stay in Rivendell, stay as long as you wish. You are amongst friends here. Falco nodded. Thank you for the gracious offer. I would like to get back to Bree and possibly onto the Shire to deliver this to Bilbo before the snow comes. If I leave tomorrow, I believe I could make it. If all goes well, yes, I believe I could. Elrond nodded his head in response. Very well then. We will make sure you have enough provisions to last you on your return. And I'll send a party out with you to ford of Bree-Land. The Great East Road is more dangerous now than it has been in some time. You must ever be watchful. Speaking of which, can you tell me more about trolls? Falco asked. As I mentioned before, I saw one on my way here. Fortunately, I had my wits about me and was able to keep out of sight. But if by chance I'm surprised by one, or come across its hole, what does one do? Elrond without hesitation responded. It is best for you not to engage with a troll, alone. They are tough as the rocks of the mountain. If you do, remember they are not as intelligent as you. They can tend to be distracted very easily, and from what you described, stone trolls turn to stone in sunlight. If you happen on one, hope it is close to the dawn when that happens. Falco sat back and smiled. Yes, well, that's exactly what I thought. Stay away. I'll make sure to stay on the south side of the road until the last bridge. Yes, that's what I'll do. Elrond went about his day, with Falco spending the day visiting with Billy in the stables and taking in what could the awe and wonder that was Rivendell. Billy was quite content with where he was, and Falco worried that he wouldn't leave forever. Walking across the bridge, Billy now in tow, and guided by the elves on horseback, dressed in elven battle wear, each carrying an elvish spear, bow, and sword to the side, Falco turned to once again seeing the buildings of Rivendell. Hopefully not for the last time. Elrond was on the steps of the front porch and held up his hand. Falco waved in response. Off they went, the unlikeliest of a trio, Falco thought, to leave Rivendell and out into the valley. The day was cool but dry, the sky sunny with the occasional cloud breaking up the slight warmth of the sun. Winter would soon set in a number of weeks, but Falco hoped he could be home in Bree before the first flake of snow would fall. The provisions he received from Rivendell surely would last him the journey, if not for a month or more, and Falco's skill to hunt and forage would easily extend any of his rations. His worry wasn't food, nor finding place to camp. His worry was the troll, of what happened to the dwarves, and although he didn't let on that he would to Elrond, he did want to check out that troll hole, his hobbit-like curiosity now getting the better of him. Crossing the ford of Bree-Land, Falco bid farewell to his elvish guard, and they quickly turned back toward the path to Rivendell. The sun set further down in the western horizon, and Falco, not wanting to travel any further, looked for an appropriate place to camp, safe away from the rushing waters of the Bree-Land and off the Great East Road. Book 3, Chapter 4. Falco panned his vision up and down the western bank of the river Bree-Land, and spotting a nice grass, level section just above the high water mark, Falco prepared to set camp for the evening. The later afternoon sun, now setting low to the west, became obscured by the now dark gray clouds, casting a deep long shadow over the river valley. What was a nice warm, later fall day quickly changed to a chilly, cold, and dark evening. Let's get a fire going, Billy. Don't want the chill of the night to set in too early before supper. Falco expressed rather quickly to Billy responding with a hurried neigh. Fortunately for Falco, there was enough dry deadfall and burnable debris from the year's previous flooding that he hadn't needed to go far to collect enough wood for the fire. Setting the pile he now placed within a circle of rocks, soon a roaring fire and the subtle glow of red and orange illuminated the riverbank. Folco prepared for supper, and Billy, standing like a loyal sentry on guard, minding to the grasses nearby. Folco prepared a light supper. The elves hadn't given him much in regards to meats for his journey, mostly root vegetables and elven bread. It was good, mind you, and even after a few bites from it, he felt a little fuller. But it did not do much to lift one's inner spirits like a nice piece of bacon, sausage, with some fried onions and tasty potatoes. Sure, he had the potatoes and thoroughly enjoyed them, but longed for the kitchen table, a full plate, and a tankard of ale. The inner reflection of home was broken up by the sound of the skies opening up with a deluge of rain, and although the area that Folco set camp was nice and flat, and up from the river, it provided little cover from the rain, now falling without stopping. Folco quickly pulled up the hood of his cloak, wrapped his body up, and kept the fire going as hot as he possibly could. Heavier and heavier the rain fell, and Folco started to get the uneasy feeling that something was amiss, and he was in imminent danger. He looked from side to side, and something peculiarly caught his eye. Streams of water now coming down from the high above the riverbank flowed down towards the ruin and on both sides of the camp. And with each passing moment, the water flowed more and more. "Billy, I think it's best we move from here." Folco now grabbed for his pack, spear, and bow, and in standing felt the ground underneath his feet starting to give way. Quickly the two dashed along the now loose and muddy banks of the river, slipping and at times sliding down, but finally landing on a large outcropping of bedrock, just enough for both Folco and Billy to rest on. Wet, muddied, and now chilled to the bone, Folco huddled next to his trusted companion for the rest of the night. Morning came and Folco opened his eyes, and although the skies were gray and bleak, no rain was falling. Folco looked about, and all around, save for where he and Billy now stood, was a muddied mess of debris. Folco could see no signs of where he had been before. "Well, Billy, we must be a little more careful in picking out a spot to rest and eat from now on. We may not be so lucky next time." Folco now grabbing the reins for Billy and leading him down to the river's edge and back up towards the main road. Not taking any chances on another slide happening, Folco broke for breakfast high on the ridge overlooking the river valley, and then proceeding on the east road west towards Bree. Reaching the eastern edge of the troll shawls, the images of the dwarven merchants and the troll emerging from its hole, Folco grasped his spear a little harder. The warning from Malron now being played back in his mind. Folco taking heed, he led Billy down the south side of the road and down into the adjacent embankment, limiting any chance encounters with a troll, or so he thought. Another night and day passed, and Falco's journey so far was without incident. The great east road was blanketed by the troll shawls with its craggy rocks and old dark trees to the north, and to the south, similar looking trees and rocks, but a gradual thinning of the forest and then into rolling hills of wild grasses and brushes. Folco was getting close to the area where he had found the dwarven remains and where he saw the troll in its hole, and now his curiosity was starting to get the better of him. He had, of course, heard Bilbo's retelling of the story of his encounter with the three trolls in this very shaws, and of the treasure that he and the Thorns company of dwarves had taken, of the ancient elven blades they used to fight to reclaim their home of Erebor. Bilbo even mentioned Gandalf, the Grey Wizard himself, found his blade within that troll hole as well. Could a trove of coins, a blade, or even another ring be found in that troll's lair, not far from where Folco now stood? Falco's mind and heart raced on the thought of it, and he was starting to get restless in the excitement. Then, Elrond's voice came clear into Falco's mind again, and Folco relaxed, now realizing the folly of his thoughts. He stood no chance on sneaking in and finding treasure in a troll hole, let alone facing one in a deadly combat. He barely made it out alive from the encounter with the Southerners on the northern road over Bree, and considered himself lucky escaping from the nameless thing below the hills of Skerry. The more he thought of it, the realization that he was best to avoid fighting at all costs was probably the best decision he could make. Still, the pull of a horde of fortune pulled ever at him, but he decided to move on and continue west towards Bree. The troll and its lair can wait. Finding a safe space to set up camp and figuring he had a couple of hours left before twilight, and the skies were clear and the wind light, Falco decided to hunt for some wild game. It did not take him long before he returned to Billy, grazing peacefully on some grasses and some wildflowers still hanging onto whatever warmth was left in the air. "Well, Billy, the land taketh like our last camp, but then giveth today. Fresh rabbit for today's supper." Falco now grinning, pleased with the spoils of his hunt. Suddenly, and without warning, Falco heard a voice call from behind him. "And a mighty fine rabbit it is." Falco quickly spun around, crouching low, dropping his prize on the ground and now holding his spear at the ready. The sun now had set behind the horizon without a fire yet lit. Falco could hardly see the features of the figure now walking towards him from behind a large boulder. The figure stood tall and had a heavy build towards him, not as tall as the troll he had saw before reaching Rivendell. Hooded, Falco could see links from what appeared to be chainmail from under his cloak. A bow was slung across his shoulders and the blade was sheathed to the belt to his side. With hands raised, he spoke calmly to Falco. "No need for quarrel, my friend. I am not here to rob you, but to share the warmth of the fire tonight and the spoils of our hunt." The man motioned for Falco to look over incidentally towards Billy, and Falco could scarcely believe his eyes. With just enough light, Falco saw the carcass of a deer laid across one of the boulders near Billy, who had been still content and unfazed by the newcomer. Who are you?" Falco now pushed himself up from a standing position, but still held the spear at the ready with both hands. "My kin call me Eridan, and I am a ranger." Falco could clearly see now the telltale signs of a ranger in the man now before him. Falco lowered his spear and relaxed it a little. "I am Folco Hornblower, of Bree. Did not expect to see someone out here. At first I thought you were a troll." Falco was still suspicious, but the man before him did not have stature, nor the foulness about him that Falco thought trolls would have. "If I were a troll, you would have smelled me a mile away." The man now lowered his hands and motioned over to the carcass of the deer and over towards Billy. "I do not know about you, but I'm quite hungry. Let us start a fire and share in the spoils of our hunt. We are safe here. No trolls will be bothering you this night." Falco now lowered his spear. "Well, that is good, because the last one I saw, and what it did, I shudder to think of it now." Falco now relieved that no fight was to occur this night. His stomach growled, and he was reminded now that he was real hungry, and so wanted some freshly roasted meat over the fire. "I guess we should start a fire then, right? Ah, over here. I cleared out a spot where I was going to start one. My, that is one fine deer you snagged. And here look at me thinking the rabbit was good. Well, it is, but deer, very fine indeed." Falco now ranted on. "Yes, well, I was lucky to happen on it. I would be just as happy with your spoil as I would with mine. I'm just glad that I could share it. Come, let's get the fire roaring and this meat cooked. It'll be a cool night tonight." Eridan, now working on setting up the fire and spit to roast the venison from the deer and the rabbit, while Falco gathered wood for the fire. Not long after, a fire illuminated the camp and both Falco and Eridan prepared the meat. "So, you were from Bree, not of the Shire?" Eridan now asked of Falco. Falco, now skewered the skinned and prepared rabbit, responded, "That is correct. My family has been living in Upper Bree Hill for generations, probably even before my fellow Shire kin crossed the Brandywine. And you know, where do you call home?" Falco now placed the spit over the fire, rotating it ever so often as not to burn the meat. Eridan looked all around, and then to Falco. "Out here, in the wilds of the land. This is home." Falco noticed a slight smile come across Eridan's face. "Yes, well, you rangers are a solitary bunch. But I do say it'd be great traveling the road. All this fresh air has been wonderful." Falco now looking up to the sky and stars above. "Now what would a small halfling such as yourself and his pony be doing so far from home?" Eridan now gave Falco an inquisitive look. Falco didn't know how to respond. He didn't want to let on that he was just in Rivendell, or in some direction from Bilbo. Falco eyed Eridan closely, but couldn't sense any ill intent in Eridan's actions, or demeanor for that matter. If there were any intent from Eridan, he for surely would have surprised him when he returned from catching the rabbit, or waited until he was asleep to do harm, Falco thought at least. Well, you see, I always wanted to find Rivendell, the place of the elves, and I was told how wonderful a place it was. Mother said I was foolish to go, but she couldn't stop me, she said, so off I went. Falco now chuckled and smiled. And did you find Rivendell? Aradan now setting his prepared meat of deer on a spit and over the fire. Well, I would like to say I had, but I searched high and low the land past the river. Bruinen, it's called, right? But Rivendell eludes me, and with winter soon upon us, I figured it was best to head back to Bree. I did find. Falco paused, the images of the fallen dwarves and the troll now clear in his mind. Find what? Aradan asked of Falco. A most horrific sight. You see, not far from here, back east in fact, just off the road, I found some dwarves, all their arms and legs just ripped from their bodies. Falco again paused, and he held back the urge to vomit from his stomach. The thought of the bodies and the smell of the troll from memory now seemingly all about him. You see, Aradan, I came upon a troll after following a path from the dwarven campsite. Fortunately, I wasn't seen by the troll as it climbed out of its horrid hole, but those poor dwarves, nothing was left, just their limbless bodies and head. Aradan now intensely looked at Falco and then peered off into the east. When you set off the road, was it to the south or to the north? The troll shaws? Falco looked at Aradan. North. I came back to where Billy, my pony, was resting and then led him over the embankment onto the south of the road and down a ways eastward from that troll hole. I figured it was best to get as far away as possible, lest I be torn limb from limb. Aradan now tended to the roasting meat. There has been some worry in these parts for some time, trolls inching closer and closer to the road. And yes, very prudent of you to leave the troll be. Now, tell me everything you know about the troll and where. Falco now knew Aradan was serious. He could sense with him a protectionist spirit, not of himself, but of the land around. As far as Falco knew, rangers venture far into the wilds, protectors of the woods. The animals and the land's protection from foul creatures. At least that's the stories Falco's grandfather had told him. Normal Bree-Landers figure them as outcasts, as vagabonds, never-do-wells. But Falco always wondered what they saw out here in the wilds, what experiences they met, what they did all the time. After Tursdan saved Falco's life, and now Aradan. Sitting across the fire, Falco knew the rangers were of noble, honorable hearts and good intents. Falco told him everything about that night seeing the troll. Aradan held on to Falco's every word. In the morning, show me. If this troll has a hole so near to the road, it will not be safe for anyone traveling on it. We leave at dawn. Aradan tended to the meat, and once complete, later in the evening, the hobbit and ranger feasted on the freshly cooked meat of deer and rabbit, and swapped stories of this and other hunts. Falco was awakened by Aradan, now nudging at his shoulder. The air was damp and cool, a light mist blanketed the land. A small fire, which Aradan had said earlier, as he was preparing more meat for the day ahead. Billy neighed and fed on some nearby grasses, and Falco wagered they were about an hour west of the dwarven camp in Trollhole. Aradan, standing eating some meat, looked at Falco. Leave what you can, we travel quiet and light. Your pony is safe here, and no harm will come of him. He turned away, now bending, testing his bow, checked his longsword, and then ensured his mail, gloves, and boots were tight. Falco looked, and realizing now that he wore under his cloak a suit of ringed mail. He hadn't seen rangers with such armor before, tending to stick with just leathers or hides, or at least that's what Falco thought. I have never seen a ranger wear that before. Falco now pointed to Aradan's chest. Aradan smiled, still tightening some more straps and the belt around his waist. No, not usually, but I'm not your usual ranger. Come, we have a troll to hunt. Falco now looked perplexedly at Aradan. Hunt? You never said anything about hunting a troll. Aradan stood now before Falco, an intimidating force if Falco ever saw one. That troll must be taken care of, or I'm afraid those won't be the only dwarfs or men or other people to find the same fate. Falco, now standing, brushing away the crumbs of his breakfast, proceeded in haste to gather his gear and his courage about him. He tested his bow, checked his spear, and looking back at Barrelak's hunting knife as he set it in its sheath and onto his belt. Falco took in a deep breath and nodded to Aradan that he was ready. Off the two unlikely of hunters went, Billy now standing by himself as he quietly neighed as Falco and Aradan went off into the mist and out of sight. The morning mist dissipated, but the low-lying clouds cast a dreary and grey light across what Falco and Aradan were skulking through with the Trollshaws. Falco had led Aradan past the dwarven encampment, and after only stopping briefly to check out for any signs of recent tracks or disturbances, they proceeded up the trail Falco followed previously to the troll hole. Falco and Aradan pressed forward, and despite it being day, they still maintained as quiet a presence as possible, for although the troll tended to stick with their own, orcs and other creatures may be nearby, and in wait. They reached the troll entrance, first smelling the foul stench from the cavern into the rock, and then seeing the hastily discarded rock and wood surrounding the whole entrance. Falco and Aradan now lay behind some brush, side by side, careful to not to make it much more noise than they already had. Now we wait. We wait until dusk. I'll set up closer to the hole itself. You stay here and guard our way back. Once that beast climbs out of its hole, we strike first with our bows, and then close in. Be true to aim, Falco. We need to knock this troll down hard and fast. They may be tough as stone, but they're not invincible. And with that, Aradan went off to the other side of the cave entrance, and if it were not for Falco watching him closely and setting place, he for sure would not have been able to see him or pick him out from under the brush. Falco hoped he was hidden as Aradan. As the hours passed, Falco kept careful watch to the hole and the surrounding area, the place eerily quiet and devoid of any bird or other forest creatures. The wind would sometimes blow past, and as it did, the foul stench of the troll hole would cause Falco to urge, but fortunately Falco kept the contents of his stomach down. He rationed what he could, too afraid to move, and too afraid that another whiff of troll smell would cause him to wrench and vomit. Either way, he was focused on the task before them. The light of the day now dimmed, and dusk was upon the hobbit and the ranger of the north. Moments passed. The forest and hillside found themselves on the were dead silent. Suddenly, a large creaking and scraping of the wood against rock was heard within the cave. Falco remembered the sounds previously, and knew the troll was opening its hole to the outside, and was soon to be visible. A few grunts from inside, and the troll lumbered itself up and out of the ledge, looking around, sniffing, its large wooden club resting on the rock floor in its left hand. It continued to sniff and pan back and forth, first looking over the Falco's direction for a moment, and then suddenly it shifted its gaze over towards Aradan's location. "Oi, who goes there? Smell your foul stench I can." As it now picked up a large rock by its feet and flung it towards Aradan. Aradan barely jumped out of its way as the rock landed in a huge crash and breaking of wood and rock. Falco now leapt from his crouched position, knocked an arrow and aimed it true to the back of the troll, now facing towards Aradan's position. The arrow flew true and struck deep into the upper back, dead center into its spine. The troll let out an ungodly howl and cry in pain as the arrow, to Falco's surprise, dug deep into its toughened skin. The troll remained mobile, however, and now turned itself to look where the arrow came from, spotting Falco, just visible over the covering brush he was hiding behind. "What are you? You're no man." The troll now looked a little surprised at Falco's appearance. Distracted by Falco, the troll didn't notice Aradan, now aiming an arrow again to the same area Falco pierced with his arrow. Aradan released the arrow, and it struck true, deep into the tissue of the troll, below the scapula on the left side. The troll again made an even louder howl in pain, the sound echoing throughout the Trollshaws. If there were any more trolls, orcs, or other foul beasts nearby, for sure they would have heard it by now, Falco thought. Aradan now let out a scream and charged with his longsword in both hands at the troll. Falco dropped his bow and, grabbing his trusted spear in both hands, did the same. The troll looked back and forth now at the charging hobbit and ranger, seemingly dumbfounded at what was happening. It now swung its heavy club up, but had yet to make a move to either Falco or Aradan. Falco closed the gap fast to the troll, digging the spearhead deep into its right thigh. The troll now jolted back with the pain. Aradan, charging full speed into the troll, sliced at the same leg, causing a gash to the back of it, the leg now buckling under the troll's immense weight. The troll let out another loud yell as it now, intent on striking hard at Falco, swung the heavy wooden club down and hitting Falco right into the midsection. Falco flew through the air, landing hard against the wall of the rock outside the troll cave, the air in his lungs now forced out by the impact of both the club and the hitting of the wall. Falco now lay dazed and his vision faded, but the rush of battle and survival came coursing through his mind and body. It was fight or die. Falco shook off the daze and, still grasping his spear, engaged with the troll once more, a little less recklessly, of course. All the while, the troll had turned its sight towards Aradan, who boldly stood his ground, toe-to-toe with the troll. Aradan rolled out of the way as the troll lumbered to slam down with his fist on Aradan, a strike to its back shoulder seemingly causing it to issue in doing so. The troll's huge forearm, now exposed, gave Aradan the opportunity to strike hard with his longsword, again causing a slash into the tough skin of the troll, but still the troll continued to fight. Falco, now seeing an opening, lunged forward with his spear, but whether it was the weakened strength from the previous blow or the tough skin of the troll, the head of the spear failed to make its mark. The troll now stood back, lifting and swinging the heavy club with its right hand towards Aradan, Aradan anticipating the oncoming attack and ducking out of its way. But before Aradan gained position, the troll left hand came crashing down upon the ranger's back, knocking him towards and against the adjacent wall of the stone hillside. Aradan quickly regained his composure and lunged forward, driving his longsword up and into its upper abdomen, deep into its inner chest wall. The troll let out a horrifying cry of pain, which echoed further throughout the surrounding trees and hills. It pulled and stumbled back, almost falling over and onto Falco, who, by the time it happened, shifted back and to the side against the side of the hill, near the troll's cave entrance. Falco for sure thought this was the killing blow, but the words of Aradan now came across his mind. They are tough as rocks of the mountain. And he now saw it so. The troll took in a deep breath and then proceeded to let out a loud, booming yell. And if it wasn't completely angered now, that last blow surely made it so. The troll now looked at Aradan with contempt, its eyes fixed on the ranger, and it lurched forward, both hands now grasping onto the heavy wooden club, intent on squashing the man before him into the rock. Falco quickly sprang forth the wall of rock and, not knowing if it would work, set his spear between two rocks. And as the troll stepped towards Aradan, it tripped, falling headfirst into the rock of the hillside. Falco scarcely could believe that it worked. Aradan, now seeing the troll, face first into the rock and laying prone, dug and drove his blade deep into the exposed back of the stone troll's head. The troll's arms, legs, and body twitched violently as Aradan pushed it deeper and deeper until it was through into the rock on the ground. Falco scarcely believed what he just saw and experienced, and as Aradan looked to the hobbit, he pulled the blade from the now lifeless troll. Falco's face was now one of amazement at what just transpired, as well as horror about what could have been. Aradan, as he was wiping off his blade with the bottom of his cloak, walked over and patted Falco on the shoulder. "Well fought, my friend. Stout and tough hobbits are. How's your chest?" Aradan now looking over Falco, looking for signs of obvious wounds. Falco shook his head, turning his gaze from the troll up to Aradan. "I've seen better days," Falco said quietly. "What do we do now?" Aradan looked back at the troll, then walked over to its hole. "Well, I'm not one to leave a troll unexplored, but considering evening is upon us, and any orc or beast for miles around knows something is here, we best make our way back to camp. We'll return in the morrow. Come, let us get back to the road while there is still some light left to see." Falco, now being led by Aradan, returned back to the camp, Billy as content as he was when he left earlier that morning. Unlike the misty, dull, and dreary day from previous, the morning was met bright and sun and relative warmth. Falco and Aradan proceeded to the troll hole, and by mid-morning they were there, with no obvious signs of any further visitations by another troll, orc, or any other foul beast. The stench of the troll and its lair remained the same, Aradan advising it would take a while before the foulness is removed by the winds and washed away by the rains. The hobbit and ranger, now with torch in hand, walked down into the troll hole. Folco covered his mouth with a handkerchief, barely being able to keep his breakfast in his stomach, as the feeling to urge was stronger than ever before. To Folco, Aradan seemed unfazed. A small maze of natural and carved tunnels and openings made up the troll's hole. One large, deep tunnel ran seemingly far into the mountain, Aradan commenting that it probably leads for miles and miles underground to other troll lairs within the troll shells. Adventurous to both Folco and to Aradan, littered throughout were scores of mercantile goods, coins, and other valuable goods. Aradan focused more on the various items of worth to one of the wilds: rope, axes, leather satchels, and the like. Folco sifted through the piles, collecting what he could into his pack and taking one of the large leather bags and filling it with coins, jewelry, and other precious items. Securing the bulk of the haul from the troll hoard and on to Billy, the rest into his backpack, Folco followed Aradan down back to where the dwarven merchants had camped. "I'm not sure how dwarves like to be buried, Aradan. Do you?" Folco now asked of Aradan. Aradan looked to Folco, and after a few moments looked around the campsite, and he responded, "That I am not sure of as well, Folco. I'll take care of what I can. The birds and other forest scavengers have made most of what was left, but I'll bury the bones. For you best be off and on the road. Nothing will trouble you from here to the bridge. I'm surprised this troll was able to make hold here. They haven't traveled this far south for an age. We must keep a better eye on the road and these shaws." Aradan now lost in thought, or so Folco thought he was. "Are you sure? I can help you out with the bodies. Would like to know that they've been tended to." Folco now insisting he stay to help. Aradan shook his head no. "If you want to make it back to Bree before the first snowfall, you best be leaving now." The ranger now looked to the skies and took in a deep breath of air. "The cold of winter is fast approaching. It will be early this year, and you best be on your way, Folco. I bid you safe travels and look forward to more stories if you are ever back this way again." Aradan smiled and held out his hand to Folco. Folco returned the gesture. "And I as well, Aradan. If you are ever in Bree, come find me on Bree Hill or at the Pony. You'll always have a place to stay and a warm meal ready." With that, Folco nodded, turned around, and guided Billy out and back to the Great East Road. It was 18 days since Folco left Rivendell on his way to Bree, as he crested over the top of the large hill where the road crested on the summit. The familiar sight of the Chetwood to the north, and Bree Hill, with smoke rising from the many chimneys, making up the village of Bree filling the valley. Snow now started to fall as a chill wind now blew from the north, and Folco knew he must just had made it before the long dark of winter would set in. "We're home, Billy. We're home." Folco now brushing down Billy's mane, Billy rubbing up against Folco and neighing approvingly as the two adventurers proceeded down the hill and towards the village of Bree. Book 3 Extended. It was still a good day's trek to Bree Hill proper, and a thought crossed Folco's mind. The depths of winter was still a ways away. Besides the Rivendell wine he received from Lord Elrond, which was a great gift in its own right, Folco thought he best bring something else back for the long winter to his parents, and venison would be a welcoming gift for the upcoming feast during Yule. Of course, it wasn't completely without benefit to Folco, as he'd head to Archet and attempt to hunt deer in the Chetwood. His grandfather had an Archet hunting bow, a fine, high-quality bow that was unparalleled in its craftsmanship, or so the boyars of Archet proudly said, and from Folco's knowledge they were. Anyone seen with one, you knew for sure that they were a great hunter and a marksman, as the only way to get one of these finely crafted bows was to show your prowess by felling a 10-point deer on a 3-day hunt. The people of Archet guarded their wares with the utmost of pride, so rare indeed should one find an outsider with one in their hands. Folco hoped his grandfather was still remembered by the people of Archet, but that was a time ago.
and the people of Archet, even the hobbits that lived there, were wary of anyone from Bree. Reaching the eastern edge of the Chetwood, and having hunted with his grandfather for the better part of his tweens, Folco knew the trails to get to Archet, where others less experienced would be lost. It was late in the afternoon, the late November sun now below the horizon. The forest darkened quickly with the fading light. Folco was not wary, however, as he knew soon the glowing lanterns of Archet would soon be upon him. Sure enough, he soon reached the 20 or so cabins making up the village, in a flat area of partially exposed ground, the large boughs of the trees overhanging and providing some cover over the buildings. Folco had been in Archet many times with his grandfather during their hunting expeditions, but only now noticed that the chimneys of the cabins were positioned in such a way as to be in between the overhanging branches, clearing a way for smoke to rise up and into the sky. Folco proceeded to the only place in town for visitors, aside from the training post, and that was none other than the Green Fletcher Inn. Folco set Billy along the side, and quickly brushing him down and rubbing his head, he proceeded into the inn. The door opened with a loud creaking, the iron hinges seeming tight against the wood. As Folco entered, all who had been seated at the bar had stopped what they were doing and looked. A brief moment passed, and the patrons all returned to what they were doing. The place was warm, rustic. The room smelled of burning wood that made up most of the Chetwood. "Welcome, traveler. Food, drink, or sleep?" the innkeeper, pouring a pint of ale, asked of Folco. "All three," Folco curtly said. "Grab a seat then where you may. We'll be right with you." Folco now looked around the room and spotted a small table to the side, near the fireplace, and he sat. The patrons at one of the other tables all glanced at Folco, studying him a little more. Folco thought their expressions were one of some confusion. They knew him to be of the Bree-Land hobbits, but with the recent weeks of travel on the Great East Road, the battle with the troll, the state of his clothing, and his weathered-looking skin of being in the wilds now for some time, they couldn't quite make any sense of it. That's what Folco thought, at least. He sat down and looked about the room. Adorning the mantel of the large stone fireplace was a series of mounted, taxidermized heads of various animals of the Chetwood. Deer, wolf, moose, even a bear. Along the walls of the room were a series of mounted antlers, and Folco could see from the nearest one each had been dated with the name of the hunter who brought back the prize. Each set of antlers were 10 points or more, and Folco now wondered if his grandfather's name appeared on one of the prize trophies. Sure enough, and just behind where he was seated was his grandfather's name. Folco proudly smiled. "So, what will it be then, Mr.?" the innkeeper now asked of Folco. Folco looked up, the smile still on his face. The special and a pint of ale. Been a while since I felt the warmth of a nice hearth and a plate of hearty food." The innkeeper looked over at Folco. "Yes, well, it does appear you must have crawled out of whatever hole you were under. Where'd you come from, anyway?" Folco chuckled. "Bree Hill, but it's been a couple months since I've been home." The innkeeper cocked his eyebrow and had an inquisitive look. "That explains it, then. You look like someone dragged you through the wringer without washing the clothes first. Very well, then. Special and a drink coming right up." And off he turned and into the inn's kitchen. Folco returned his gaze on the hanging antlers which bore the name of his grandfather's underneath. Folco now wondered if he would be so fortunate to hunt one similar, and have his prize trophy hung here as well. Folco finished the evening with little interruption from either the patrons or the inn's proprietor. Folco soon retired to the simple comfort of the room upstairs after seeing to Billy was safe outside. The simple accommodations, although not like Rivendell's, the Pony, or the Wood's End in Woodhall, were warm, the bed comfortable, and the blankets welcoming. Morning came and the sound of the forest was quiet, with the occasional chopping of wood, sawing of logs, and the shouts from loggers sounding throughout the village. Folco went downstairs for breakfast, and while there he inquired about how to get one of those finely crafted Archet hunting bows. "Aye, well, they come at a price, my young lad. A show of your worth. You ain't getting a bow from Archit unless you are apt enough. You see these? The innkeeper points around the room. These represent the only Archit bows to leave this village in the hands of outsiders. You bring in something like that, you get yourself a fine bow indeed. Falco looked around and turned back to the innkeeper and smiled. That it? The innkeeper laughed, as he now slapped the breakfast plate loaded with taters, sausages, and scrambled egg. 10 points and 3 days. Falco grabbed the utensils and proceeded to eat the food. Fair enough. See you in 3. The innkeeper laughed some more and proceeded about his daily routine. Falco finished his meal, and after securing his stay and Billy's in the stables for the next 3 days, Falco went out to see his friend. I'll be gone for a couple of days, my good friend. I've arranged for the nice warm place while I'm gone. Just hunting out here in the wood for a deer, going to get me a fine bow, if I'm lucky. Billy neighed in a joking manner. Falco laughed in return. Oh, it's like that, eh? Well, you go ahead and think that, but I'll be bringing back a nice 10-pointer before you get too comfortable. See you in a few. Taking his bow and quiver, securing his hunting knife and his pack, he went into the chetwood. Now Falco knew he wasn't the best of hunters, but he knew enough following alongside with his grandfather where to look, what signs to look out for when hunting wild game. Deer were relatively plenty in the chetwood, but you still had to be very on the watch for the right track, lest they spot you first and prance off, never to be seen again. Falco hadn't expected much on the first day. Maybe a trail here, a tuft of deer fur on the tree or branch there. But he happened on a fresh set of tracks of a seemingly large buck. Falco knew so by the wider front set of prints versus the hind set. His grandfather had shown him the differences between a buck and a doe, and he was now thankful for the time spent on the many hunts previously to him. Falco stayed low and quiet, and being a hobbit, wagered his profile was almost unseen by any cautious animal, and owing to his clothing being dirtied and weathered from the weeks of travel and camp along the Great East Road, his scent was all but impossible to smell, or so he hoped. Either way, Falco thought the advantage was his over his intended prey. The days were now much shorter than he would have liked, and continuing until he could no longer see the trail before him, he found a suitable place to rest for the evening, ready to pick up the trail at the sign of any light. Dawn came and Falco was awakened by the sound of crackling branches on the ground. What birds were still left in the forest before the onset of winter sang songs throughout. The forest was starting to awaken. He heard the sound again, and carefully and slowly he readied his bow and an arrow. He fortunately set himself up in a fairly large branch earlier as he rested for the evening. Hobbits, after all, were deft at sleeping anywhere, so his position was primed for the kill. The forest brightened under the canopy with a slowly rising sun, and there Falco saw it. A large but graceful buck stood majestically a distance away from Falco. Falco studied the creature, and with a little more light now breaking through, Falco could count 12 tines. Falco's heart raced with anticipation, but now his grandfather's voice echoed throughout his mind, telling him to calm himself down, breathe in slowly, practice patience. The time to strike will present itself. Falco waited, and in an almost seemingly surreal moment, the large buck casually grazed on the grasses ahead of Falco, moving ever so closely. Minute by minute, Falco had set himself in a perfect shooting position, securely balancing himself high in the branch, using whatever leverage he could from the tree to make his aim steady and true. Slowly and with strength, he pulled back on the bow, and despite the brisk coldness of the late November morning, the wood of his bow did not make a sound. Silent and quiet, Falco's breathing was. Breathing out a deep, slow breath, and having now aimed carefully for the area of the chest where the heart of the creature was, he let go the string, the arrow flying like a diving falcon, straight and deep into the chest of the large buck. The buck jumped at the sudden strike and then keeled over, lifeless from the unsuspecting attack. Falco smiled, but then showed a more sullen expression. He jumped down from the branch and onto the forest floor and walked over to the now slain deer. It was surely a majestic animal, Folco thought. Falco's grandfather always told him to be thankful and pay his respects to any animal he would fell, saying a life is still a life, and Falco just did so. Falco now set up a small camp, and spending the rest of the day and into the evening, prepared the hunted deer for transport back to Archet. It was a large deer, and he took what edible meat he could reasonably carry, roughly 40 pounds, leaving the rest of the carcass for the forest to reclaim. The antlers were large and cumbersome, but, for Falco, outfitted them on his pack, and when strapped across his shoulders, the antlers sit stretched out and completely in front of Falco. Falco chuckled at the thought of what others would see as he walked back into town. Falco left early in the morning, shortly after the dawn, and proceeded back to Archet. No sooner had he entered the village than the commotion had started. "Well, my eyes have never seen such a sight," yelled out an Archet villager. "Hobbits! Who knew they were such hunters? Fierce like the badger they must be," cried out another. "Dare say half the beast is back there in the woods," chuckled another. Falco smiled and nodded and proceeded to the inn. Breaking through the door, everyone now stopped to look towards it. Falco sidestepped inside, the 12 points of the antler too wide to make it through the door. No one made a sound. Turning now to face the innkeeper, Falco proceeded to remove the set of antlers and his pack down on the room floor. "All right, boys, pony up. Come on, all those you wager now. I'll get the others when they come in later." The innkeeper now looked at Falco. "Well there, Mr. Hornblower, that's a mighty fine trophy you got there. Luck or skill, who knows, but that's some fine hunting on ye part." The innkeeper now walking over towards Falco. And I see you dressed to meet yourself. I knew you hobbits were handy in the fields, but by the looks of it, you're quite handy at hunting." After a few more pleasantries, Falco gave some of the venison to the innkeep, and the rest he saved for home. As for the antlers, the innkeep set it aside on a long table near the bar. "Now, you've satisfied one requirement of the bow, but there's still another. I'll call the forester to come have a look. He'll want to speak with you. Still one more requirement yet before you take your leave with an Archet bow." The innkeeper now sternly saying to Falco. Falco showed some confusion on his face. I see. Very well. I'll take my leave in the room until they arrive." Falco retired to his hired accommodations. Morning passed, and after lunch, the forester of Archet arrived. Walking towards the bar, and the innkeeper of the inn spoke in a curt manner. "Where's this would-be hunter I'm hearing about?" The innkeeper motioned over to Falco, who by this time was just finishing up his lunch, sitting over by the hearth under the set of trophy antlers from the hunt his grandfather did many years earlier. The forester looked over to Falco, cocked his brow in a sense of bewilderment, and then walked over. "The name's Talltree, and I'm the forester of Archet. Who be you?" Standing now near the table Falco was sitting at. Falco casually laid down his teacup, wiped his mouth and face with a cloth, and looked up towards the forester. Folco Hornblower, his face and voice stern in response to Fitch Talltree. The forester shifted his eye up and over to the wall behind Falco, noticing the nameplate. He gave a slight smirk and motioned to sit down across from Falco. Falco nodded in approval. "A hunter indeed. It's been a time since a halfling has come hunting in these woods to fetch one of our bows." Now turning his head and motioning the innkeeper to bring some ale over for both he and Falco. "And by the looks of it, seems you may have been bested the previous." Falco looked up at the mounted antlers, the engraved name of his grandfather, and turning back to the forester. "He taught me everything I know about wilds, and it is by luck and luck alone that I may have bested him. I am by no means a hunter as he was. Either way, you've shown your worth. Now, I have a little proposition for you, and in turn, you'll get one of our finely crafted bows." The innkeeper now placed the filled mugs of ale on the table, and walked back to the bar. "What's the proposition?" Falco now taking the mug in hand, raising it, and saying a greeting of cheers. "I am in need of a capable hunter to join me on a hunt. Before you agree, I must warn you it'll be very dangerous and difficult to fell the beast to be hunted." Talltree now looking at Folco intensely, Folco nodding for him to continue. Fitch Talltree brushed down his unruly wild beard, and as he looked to Folco, his fierce eyes softened a little. Nigh about 10 years ago now, the former forester of Arch and I went out to hunt a brutal troll threatening the village itself. On hearing about the troll, Folco's ears perked up, and now listened more intently to the forester's words. Unfortunately, the forester then was felled by the beast. He tried to save me from its brutal attack with his club. I was able to escape, but the forester unfortunately did not. The village placed me then in charge of protecting the village ever since, and I've been waiting for the right time to hunt this creature once again. I believe that time is now, Mr. Hornblower, and although I wouldn't have guessed a halfling to be the one, fate, it would seem, wanted you to be here. Talltree now took his mug of ale and swallowed the point down whole, then slamming it down on the table with a thud. Folco nodded his head, the image of the troll from the troll shaws which he and Eridan had felled a month past, clearly in his mind's eye. Troll, you say? Just so happens, with the help of another, felled one lurking about the east road south of the troll shaws, just a month ago, on my way back here to Bree. Folco saw now in Fitch Talltree a slight sense of amazement, and the one of hope, as he smirked again under his beard at Folco. Talltree now sat back in his chair, arm rest against the back. I'd scarcely believe a story like that coming from a halfling, if it weren't for that 12-point rack on the table there. But you don't have to look like the rest of them. You've already seen your fair share of the wilds, that I can tell for sure. Talltree now leaned forward, arms resting at the table. It's too late now. Winter and Yule is soon upon us. But with the first sign of spring, your bow will be ready, and we'll go out on the hunt. Do we have a deal? Talltree now held out his large, calloused hands towards Folco. Folco paused for a brief moment, and held out his hand in response. I didn't come here to leave empty-handed, that is for sure. You have a deal, Forster Talltree. Folco now knew the archered hunting bows were unparalleled in the craftsmanship by any man, or hobbit, within leagues of Bree, and if it required the felling of a troll, then by all means he'd help it to see it done. Excellent. Come back to Archet at the first thawing. Take care, Mr. Hornblower, and when you return, your bow will be ready. Standing, Fitch Talltree slapped Falco's back and then walked out to the inn, but not before agreeing to pay for Falco's stay now and for the next time. The innkeeper nodded, and as the forester walked out, looked over to Folco. Well, my lad, ye sure full of surprises. Never met a hobbit quite like it. The innkeeper laughed as he went about his routine. Folco picked up the mug of ale, looked down at the reflection of his face in the liquid, and said to himself, What have you gotten yourself into now, Folco? Taking the mug up to his mouth, he chugged the last of the pint. Folco, with Billy in tow, made his way from Archet and back to Bree Hill. Winter now was finally starting to set in, with a blanket of snow settling down and covering the tops of the trees, the hedge and green of Bree turning white, and the smoke billowing out of each chimney from every building and hobbit hole throughout. Folco set Billy behind his family home and walked in the back door and into the kitchen. Falco's mother standing setting his place at the table. She looked over to Folco, now standing straight and proper, a sullen smile on his face. She smiled, and with restrained happiness said, Welcome home.
Yule in the year 2965 of the Third Age. Winter quickly set in shortly after Folco returned to Bree Hill, and the long cold dark of winter finally set in. Folco welcomed the quiet time he now found himself in, and unlike times before, he remained around his home, spent time attending to chores around the home, and spending time sitting near the fireplace, reflecting on the past year and all that it brought. For the first time in Folco's life, he had something more to reflect on than all the years previous combined. As a snowstorm raged on the outside and under the warm orange glow of the fire, Folco pondered all that he saw, did, and lost during the time outside the green hedge of Bree. The first walk west towards the Shire, and his unfortunate accident on the side of the road that led him to being found by Bilbo Baggins. His charge from Bilbo to deliver a letter to Bam Furlong, and the ask from Farmer Maggot to rid the marish of the beast plaguing his chickens. On meeting Barrelak after the harrowing encounter with the wolf-like creature with menacing red eyes at Buckleberry Ferry. Then he and Barrelak walking deep into the dark old forest, only to encounter two of the dreaded beasts, but, by chance, also one of the enigmatic being and his wife, Tom Bombadil and Lady Goldberry. Then sorrow crept across Falco's heart as he vividly remembered the passing of Barrelak, and although he only knew him for a short time, he considered him a close friend. Falco now thought the time spent now in the comforts of his own home, he'd remember his time with Barrelak in song. Now Folco wasn't much of a writer, and at the moment he was lost for the right words. He smiled as he thought Barrelak wasn't much for word and conversation himself, at least in the small amount of time Folco knew him. Folco continued to reflect and then on the events under the hills of Skerry, the finding of the nameless thing and the silver ring now on his finger, which came heavy across his mind and his heart. The warmth of the fire seemed to cool, the light from the flame duller and more dim. The shadows along the walls of the room seemed to grow and become increasingly more dark. The winds outside seemed to intensify. For the rest of the evening and into the rest of the time spent in Yule, the ever-present shadow that had enveloped him since he found it and put on the ring seemed to close tight on him more and more than before. Folco smiled, however, remembering that not all was dark during the time afterwards. The fortunate meeting of Tursdan after his near-fatal encounter with the Southerners on the North Greenway, and the time spent on the Great East Road heading east to Rivendell. Then he remembered, and shuddered at the thought again of the slain dwarves at the hands of the Stone Troll and the Trollshaws. Folco quickly moved his thoughts to the sights, sounds, and comfort that was Rivendell, and his short time spent in council with Elrond. The wine was a welcome gift from his parents, and if Folco ever got the chance again to meet with Elrond, or send word back, he would pass on the gratitude that his parents had shown. Folco then sat back into the chair he was sitting in, and looking into the flame, remembered now the encounter with Eredin, the other ranger of the north, and the felling of the troll who Folco had saw earlier in the Trollshaws. He wondered how Eredin fared in taking care of the dwarven bodies, and if he ever would meet the ranger again and ask. Folco hoped he would have the opportunity to meet Eredin once again. The evening drew late, and his eyes grew heavy. But now the memory of his grandfather, the stories he told of, and the time spent with him hunting in the Chetwood, eased Folco's very heart and soul. Smiling, he closed his eyes and fell fast asleep.